Thank you so much for joining us for Ankeny Gospel Church podcast. On this podcast, you can find sermons, classes, and other resources that continue to invite us into the mission of Jesus and the journey of faith. We hope this is a blessing to you, and if we can help you in any way, feel free to reach out.
Well, hello and welcome. My name is Parker McGoldrick, one of the pastors here at Ankeny Gospel Church. This is, I'm getting situated here. This is the Study Notes podcast, where we come after a sermon, and if there's like something that we can't fit into a sermon that's super important or maybe important but takes away from the point of the sermon, then we add it here on the Study Notes podcast. So that being said, this one is on Peter and the rock and the church, and really the foundation of the church and what Jesus says. So last week, we went through Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 28. And honestly, it was a doozy. That was a lot of text, which is why we're doing this podcast, because we weren't able to fit everything in. So that episode is titled, Who Do You Say I Am? It's Jesus asking his disciples, who do you say I am? And Peter responds, and the disciples respond. And it's a very, very, very powerful text and powerful teaching of Jesus to his disciples. So if you haven't listened to that, go listen to that. It should be the podcast like right before this, Who Do You Say I Am? And then you'll see what we're talking about here. But today, these study notes are going to be on just a few verses, and it's Jesus's response to Peter's confession as the Christ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the verses that we're going to talk about and just give a few points on this text, and then go from there. So this is Matthew chapter 16, verses, we'll do 15 through 20. Basically, Jesus came up to Caesarea Philippi with his disciples, and he asked them, who do you say I am? And they respond, and they're like, well, you're like one of the prophets. Some people think you're this guy. Some people think you're a John the Baptist, blah, blah, blah. Then verse 15, but you, Jesus asked them being the disciples, who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus responded, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And then this is the key verse, verse 18. And I also say to you, Peter, that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Okay, first of all, that last sentence is just so funny, because who talks like that anymore? Will have been bound and will have been loosed. We're going to get there in a second. But first, I kind of want to set up the Jesus' first response to Peter. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. In other words, what Jesus says here is he says, Simon Peter, or Simon, son of Jonah, because Simon's name is changed to Peter, which we'll get there in a second. He says, Simon, you are blessed because there's no way, no human means could have helped you understand that I am the Messiah, the Son of the living God. What's interesting is that in the other Gospels, Jesus does not say that. He doesn't say that to Peter. He actually, all it says, Peter says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says, all right, don't tell anybody. And it actually says that he rebukes them. So here in Matthew, we get this special blessing upon Simon. Now, look at how Matthew, in verse 16, Matthew calls Peter Simon Peter. Now, here's a little narrative, kind of like breaking the fourth wall strategy of Matthew. So Matthew is the author of the gospel, according to Matthew, which is why it's called Matthew. Pretty straightforward. But throughout the whole book, he calls him Peter, except the very first time. So when Jesus calls Peter, he says Simon, and in parentheses it says whose name is Peter. And then for the rest of the time, Matthew just calls him Peter. So, but what's interesting is that his name doesn't actually change to Peter until right here, right now. So even though we as the reader, it's kind of like Matthew's giving like this nod to us as the reader. He's like, back in chapter 4 when he was called, he's like, Simon, whose name is Peter, like dear reader, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. And then the rest of the time, he's just called Peter. So it's interesting. Jesus here says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. So it's almost like Matthew's like, oh yeah, by the way, remember, his name used to be Simon. But now he goes on, because flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter. Now, this sounds really like a duh moment, but this is actually where Peter's name was switched from Simon to Peter. Now, for us in English, Peter is a name, right? It's just a straight up name. But in Jesus' native tongue, which would have been Aramaic, it was not a name, it was a noun. And it was literally the word Petros, which is the word for stone or rock. So Simon says, you are the Christ, Son of the living God. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon. Also, your name's not Simon anymore. Your name is Peter, or Petra, or rock. And this is this fact that Simon's name was changed to Peter should not be overlooked. There are two of the most memorable characters in the Old Testament received a second name or a name change. So in the Old Testament, to get a name, in the Bible, really, a name is like who you were. It defined you. And when somebody gave you your name, you were like theirs, like you were their possession, not like in like a bad way possession, but like you were theirs and they are yours and all this stuff. And they have the authority and they're calling you into this thing. And it's a really cool thing. But if you remember, two characters in the Old Testament got a name change. The first was Abram to Abraham. And God, Yahweh, changed his name because he was going to be the father of a multitude. So Avram means the father. Avraham, or Abraham, means the father of a multitude, or the father of many. Next, Abraham's grandson, Jacob, remember Abraham, Isaac, Jacob got his name changed to Israel. Jacob means deceiver. Israel means wrestles with God or strives with God. Now, you might be like, cool, that's awesome. Peter got a name change too. Oh, also Saul and Paul got a name change. But listen to this. Abraham and Israel. But when both of those people were called, when Abraham was called by God and when Jacob and Israel were called by God, what happened was there was a birth of a new people of God. Abraham was called by God to bring a new people of God so that they would be the blessing to the nations. Right? And on top of that, the individual name symbolizes their crucial function. So Abram became Abraham. He's starting a new people of God, and his name symbolizes his function. Jacob, which means deceiver, is changed to Israel, which means wrestles with God. And from there, again, new people of God are birthed, right? The Jewish people, the Israelites, and their name symbolizes their function. They wrestle with God the entire Old Testament. So fast forward, and what do we see Jesus doing here? We see Jesus calling Peter, Simon, an individual, calling him Peter, which does what? One, it witnesses the birth of a new people of God. Just like when Abraham was called and given a name change, just like when Jacob was called and given a name change, that showed the birth of a new people of God. So here, Simon, changing his name into Peter, is basically Jesus saying there is a new people of God now, and it's the church, which we're going to get to there in a second. On top of that, the name symbolizes the function. So Peter means rock. It means stone or rock. And if you think about all of the things that one, Peter did, two, all of the things that the church has done, it's a church that's built on a rock, and the gates of hell will not prevail over it. And then three, on top of that, Jesus himself says, I am the cornerstone, and the church is built on this rock. And so the name change is more than just like, that's a cool name change, that's a cool thing. It's twofold. One, it's witnessing the birth of a new people of God, Jesus's community, which is the true Israel, the true humanity, the church. And the name change symbolizes the crucial function. So Peter said to Jesus, you are the Christ. Jesus says to Peter, you are Peter. And then Jesus goes on, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Now, a quick, this is where a lot of controversy is. One scholar actually says this is the most controversial verse in the Bible. I don't think that that's necessarily true, but it is pretty controversial. Basically, when the Roman Empire became Christian, they started the Catholic Church. Catholic just means universal. And so what the Catholic Church did is they actually elevated Peter. Well, I mean, Peter was a saint, right? Peter was sainted by the Catholic Church, which is a good thing. But they elevated Peter, and then the lineage of Peter. And they basically said Peter is now was the Pope. He was like the first Pope. And they came up with this theology called the infallibility of the Pope, which is basically like the Pope doesn't like sin. Like the Pope has all of the authority of the church, just like Peter had all the authority of the church. Now, this is both good and bad. It's bad because it's clear that Peter wasn't infallible, right? Peter sinned. In fact, right after this, you can't really argue that Peter was infallible, because right after this, Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And he denies him 3 times. And he gets yelled at by Paul later on in his life for, being afraid of Jewish people. So the idea that Peter was the first pope and therefore he was infallible is not true. But it is true that Peter is the rock that the church is built on. A lot of Protestants, in reaction to the Catholic belief that Peter was the first pope, and because of him, he's infallible, and all the popes are infallible. In reaction to that, they said, no. Peter isn't the rock on which the church is built. Peter's faith, or the confession, is the rock on which the church is built. So they look at this word and they're like, no, it doesn't say, on you, Peter, I will build my church. It just says on this rock, and that rock is just the confession that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So it's not Peter. Peter's just an average disciple, just like everybody else. All he did was get his name changed. And it wasn't him that the church is built on. It was his confession that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And all that, pretty much, this was a really big controversy in the recent centuries. But pretty much anybody now who's like ecumenical and like a good scholar says, well, of course it's both. Like, of course it's both. Like, Peter is the rock on whom the church is built. You can't grammatically get away from that. Some people try to take I won't get into it too much, but some people try to take in Greek, there's this thing called a declension, which is basically like the same word can be spelled differently based on how it's used. But in Aramaic and in Hebrew and sometimes in English, that's not the case. And so in Greek, it says, "And I also say to you that you are Petra, and on this Petros I will build my church." So some people say, like, see, look, the Greek word is different, so therefore Peter isn't the rock that the church is built on. Peter's faith is the rock that or Peter's like confession that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, is the rock that the church is built on. But honestly, it's literally semantics. And 2, it just doesn't take into consideration what like Greek linguistics actually is. So it's just wrong. So basically, anybody says, here's the summary. Peter the person, the disciple, is the rock on whom the church is built. And that includes his confession, right? Like, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And let's fast forward a little bit. What happened after Peter? Like, what happened in Peter's life, I mean. If you read the Acts of the Apostles, right after the 4 Gospels, who is the guy that's in charge of the Jerusalem church? It's Peter. And what is he doing? He's teaching. He's saying in Acts 2 and in Acts 3, he comes and he says, guys, don't be surprised that, like, we're not drunk. He says, the Spirit fell on us, and this is just like what happened. They're speaking in tongues, and they're doing all this stuff, and people are accusing them of being drunk. And Peter's like, no, this is exactly what Joel 2 prophesied about. He prophesied about this moment, and Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, and you missed him. And so Peter is the one, all throughout the first half of Acts especially, he was the rock on whom the church was built. In Acts 15, it was him and James and a few others that were the ones that were doing all the teaching. And they were saying, like, look, you don't have to become Jewish in order to be a Christian. You can remain uncircumcised, and you can remain unkosher in your eating things. And in Acts 10, oh my gosh, sorry, last one. Acts 10, Peter gets this vision of what? Of all these unclean foods. And then Jesus himself tells Peter, eat, these are clean. And he does it 3 times, which is interesting, almost like Peter's 3 denials. So it's clear that Peter was unique from the disciples in that he was the rock on whom the church was built. This is where in like the 4th or 5th century, the Catholic Church, in a good way, this is a good thing, they kind of came up with this idea of the first among equals. where Peter was an equal with the disciples, but he was kind of like the first. He was like the primacy, or the primary one, I guess. And so that's where that, and you can take that or leave that, but there is something to be said about Peter being the rock on whom the church was built. And then that checks out, because the next verse, Jesus says this. This is the really confusing grammatical one. Verse 19, I will give you, by the way, the you there is singular, so it's referring to Peter. I will give you, singular, i.e. Peter, the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Now, this is where the image of Peter's gate, I don't know if you've heard of that image. There's this like really kind of like Renaissance medieval image of like Peter's gate and Peter at the gate of literally of heaven. And he has the keys and he's just standing there and he's like the one to let you in or not let you in. Unfortunately, that is not, well, actually, fortunately, that is not at all what this means. Unfortunately, in like the Middle Ages, when they did all this random painting and art and all this stuff about angels and demons and heaven and hell, they really set us up for failure with our eschatological imagination. Basically, what this means, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, is if somebody was given the keys, they had the authority. They had the authority for what was good, what could come in, and what could go out. And these phrases, binding and loosing, were not referencing like people entering or not entering. They were rather always referenced in biblical literature as teachings. So whatever is bound in heaven and bound on earth by Peter, and whatever is loosed in heaven and loosed on earth by Peter, those are the teachings. So in other words, what Jesus is saying is like, Peter, you are the rock on whom the church is built, and you have the authority for the teaching of the church. Now, it's interesting. It says, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. In other words, what this means is that what Peter teaches is already what heaven itself teaches, in other words. So later, like I mentioned, in Acts 15, Peter says, hey, you don't have to be circumcised to enter, to become a Christian, to enter the kingdom of heaven. And guess what? That's exactly what God's heart is. So Peter has the authority for his teaching, which is why the church at large emphasizes teaching and good doctrine and truth so much, is because this has the power to bind and to loose, and whatever is bound in heaven or bound on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever is loosed on earth will have been loosed in heaven. So, all that to say, sorry, that was a little bit longer than I thought. All that to say, Peter's name change from Simon to Peter is really foundational because A, it brings about a new people of God, the church, and B, it acts as like a function for what the church is and what Peter is, i.e. a rock. And if something is built on a rock, then the gates of Hades cannot even overpower it. That's the first thing. Second thing is Peter, the person, the disciple, is the rock on whom the church is built. Not just his confession, but that includes his confession. And then finally, the binding and loosing on earth and in heaven refers to the teachings of the apostles. This is why basically the farther back you go, the more Christians agree with each other on things. And this is why Paul himself says, I decided to know nothing among you except Christ crucified. Also, Paul himself, after he was converted, he went to whom in order to make sure that he was saying the right things? You guessed it, he went to Peter. So Paul, where the rest of the New Testament is writing, he actually went to Peter and said, hey, is this right? And Peter said, yep, you're good to go. So that is those couple verses. Hope this was helpful, and be sure to stay tuned for the next couple sermons. Nate has a sermon coming up on the Transfiguration, and appreciate you. God bless, Godspeed, and we will see you later.
Thanks again for listening, and we pray this was a blessing to you. If you have any questions or comments about what you heard, our email is info@ankenygospel.com, or you can find us on social media @AnkenyGospel.